Thanks very much, Julian, for that kind introduction. And thanks to all of you for coming tonight. It's exciting, but also rather daunting to see so many friends, family members and colleagues all together in the same room.
I'm afraid.
Can you hear at the back? I'll shout a little louder. Yep, good. I'm not mic'd up to the sound inside this room. So this is an inaugural lecture. I have 45 minutes to talk about my favourite subject. So I'm going to start by giving you a brief overview of what the disease is like and how it affects people, and then talk more widely about the research that I've done into it. When I first mentioned the word podoconiosis, the usual response is, podo what? Because literally nobody has heard of the condition. And so I'm going to start with some pictures. I don't apologise for showing these pictures, though to some of you they may be rather gruelling. But this is what the feet of people with podoconiosis become like. You can see the skin thickening, the darkening, the roughening. You can see nodules appearing, lumps and bumps over the feet. You can see that the swelling progresses up the leg, making it heavy and unwieldy. You can see that in some cases it even fixes the foot, so a person is almost unable to walk. But let's remember that podoconiosis isn't just about feet, it's about people. You can imagine what the life of somebody with podoconiosis becomes like. Somebody with an oozing, weeping foot that attracts flies is soon to be excluded from school. Another person finds it difficult to trade in the marketplace. Many people find it very, very hard to marry anyone other than another affected person. And many are considered cursed by God for having feet like that. So you can quickly see it's not just a disability, but something that brings huge stigma and ostracisation to patients. So having given you that background, I'm going to argue the case for podoconiosis being a poster child for global health. Now, to do this, I first need to start by defining global health. And I know that for the global health master students in this room, I'm going to give a rather brief summary. They spent about a term debating this at the start of their course. And I'm going to fast forward and use an article by Copland and colleagues in The Lancet, which compared global health with public health and international health, and came up with 3 key themes that seem to apply to global health. So global health considers health issues that cross national borders, first of all. It's deeply concerned with health equity, that is, in fairness in health outcomes and delivery of health services across nations, not just within nations. And global health is underpinned by research that crosses disciplines. So given that background, I'm going to show how podoconiosis and the research that's responded to the problem fits into the umbrella of global health so very well. I'm going to do that by talking you through my introduction to podoconiosis and then the programme that resulted from it. So I go back to spring 2002, so 12 years ago, when I was living with my family in Addis Ababa, Ethiopia. I was invited by the British ambassador then, tipped off by Eldred Parry, who's in the audience here, to review a non-government organisation in the south of the country. So my colleague Claire Fuller, a tropical dermatologist, and I went to review this organisation, which at the time was one of only 2 groups delivering care for people with podoconiosis in Ethiopia. This was a Mossy Foot Treatment and Prevention Association, now Mossy Foot International. Now, before I went, I had a quick look round in the literature and asked around in some of the government offices, and it didn't seem that the condition featured whatsoever in government policy. But when Claire and I arrived, we were both greatly moved by what we saw on a personal level through meeting patients and hearing their stories, and then on a scientific level, realising that there were many, many questions as yet unanswered about the condition. We hastened back to Addis and instructed the ambassador to fund the project. And as a good epidemiologist, I started looking at the background to the condition in more depth. I did find some articles. Several of them went back to the 1930s and 40s, mostly in East Africa. And they described this condition under a number of different terms listed here. Then I was lucky. I came across this monograph by Ernest Price in the School of Public Health Library. This is a summary of Price's work over 2 decades. Ernest Price had lived in Addis Ababa in the 1970s and 1980s, and alongside his day job as a leprosy control officer, had become interested in this condition. So he had spent many years of his life investigating it, looking at the causes, the distribution, what might be done about it, and had produced this monograph and several research articles. It was him that termed the coin Podoconiosis from the 2 Greek words for dust and foot. But I also realised in the same search that there was very, very little literature after Price's work. Almost nothing had happened since he left Ethiopia. And that was true from, as far as I could see, from right around the world. So what had Price established by the early 1990s? Well, he'd looked carefully at the causes of disease and had established that the disease seemed to cluster in families. And he went as far as to guess that there was probably a heritable component to the disease. He also looked at the other side of causes of this strange foot swelling. And having excluded a number of biological agents, including bacteria and parasites, he was suddenly struck by the idea that the distribution of disease, as far as he could tell, mapped quite well to the soils of the central highlands of Ethiopia. He realised that the disease seemed to occur in people living on the red clay soils generated from long ago volcanism in those areas. He also noted, and realised that others had noted around the world before, that this condition was linked to going barefoot. It seemed particularly apparent in people who could not afford shoes and did farming work that exposed them long term to these red clay soils. Now, at the time, he didn't really comment further on that, but I think these days that should cause us to think twice. Surely this is a gross health inequity, that there are people in the world who get a disease because they cannot afford shoes or water to wash their feet. So it strikes me that straight away podoconiosis fulfills one of these core principles of global health, and it's fundamentally about health inequity around the world. What else did Price establish? Well, he travelled quite a lot within Ethiopia and then went to about another 10 or 12 countries across tropical Africa, and he established the presence of podoconiosis in about 10 of those countries. He also looked at reports from the rest of the world and considered that podoconiosis occurred in Central and Southern America and in Asia as well. So he had demonstrated that this was a health issue that crosses national borders as well. So that just leaves one further point, cross-disciplinary research, and that's really where I came in. I didn't set out to start a programme of multidisciplinary research, but it evolved like that as I realised that we needed perspectives from a whole range of disciplines to get to the bottom of this problem and to understand how we might come up with solutions to it. while I was partway through this research, I came across this quote from a review of a book by Nicholas Stern on climate change. It's called The Global Deal. And I was immediately struck by the similarities between podoconiosis as an issue and climate change. And while I would never say that podoconiosis has suffered from a suffocating embrace of science, in fact it's had rather little science applied to it so far, I did immediately see that a huge range of languages were necessary to fully understand the condition and to come up with treatment alternatives. So what I'm going to do now, and for the sort of bulk of this talk, is to take you through the range of disciplines that we've embraced in studies so far. I'm going to start with one of the earliest studies into genetics. We wanted to follow through Price's observation that the disease appeared to cluster in families. This was a project funded by the Association of Physicians of Great Britain and Northern Ireland and was sited in southern Ethiopia. There were two reasons for that. Firstly, the Mossy Foot Treatment and Prevention Association were there and helped introduce us to affected families. And second, family size is very large in this area, which made it a very powerful way of gaining information, because what segregation analysis does essentially is to look at family trees and derive information from them about the genetic background of a condition. So we studied 59 affected families, and I'm going to show you one example of a family. Males are shown as squares and females as circles, and people with the condition have got a red shading in their upper left quadrant. So here we start with a patient who's a male of 32, and we ask him about his extended family and the occurrence of disease in it. And it turns out that he has 2 affected brothers, an affected father, 2 affected paternal uncles, and an affected paternal grandmother. Now, putting together information from this family and 58 other families, also large and multi-generational, we were able to come up with an estimate of the heritability of podoconiosis. And this is a way of understanding the amount of disease that's really accounted for by genetic factors. And we estimated that about 63% of the disease was accounted for by genetic factors. This provided the foundation for an application for further study into genetics, a more expensive study requiring a different set of resources. This was funded by the Wellcome Trust as a project grant and was taken forward by Fasil Tekola, who completed his PhD studies here 2 years ago. So Fasil collected DNA samples from people with the condition and from people free of the condition and compared them using genome-wide scanning and a family-based testing approach. And from these comparisons, he was able to demonstrate an association between the disease and a particular area of the genome known as the HLA class II locus or area. Now, this is exciting. It's just the beginning of understanding how the disease pathogenesis might work, which is something that until now nobody has really understood. And it's also the basis of yet another application which Melanie Newport is taking forward, which is going to look in much more detail at this area of the genome and find out exactly which genes might be involved in susceptibility to the condition. Now, there were 2 other great spin-offs of this study. There was an article in a high-profile journal which again brought attention from the scientific community worldwide, and it was a wonderful first step for a very bright Ethiopian researcher who's now doing his postdoc studies at the National Institutes of Health with his other supervisors, and is exploring the genetic epidemiology of a range of other conditions important in Africa. Another early study took in the discipline of health economics. I'd realised early on that it was going to be important to have information on the economic burden of this disease if I was ever going to get policymakers to take it seriously. So Facile compared farmers with disease and without disease in another area of southern Ethiopia and looked at the direct and indirect costs of disease. He came up with an estimate that, projected to the rest of the country, suggested that podoconiosis was costing Ethiopia more than $200 million per annum. More recently, some preliminary cost-effectiveness analysis taken forward by a fourth-year student here at BSMS has suggested that the cost of standard treatment for a patient is as little as $55 per patient per year. And this does include infrastructural cost, that's staff costs, transport costs, as well as the costs of the consumables used for treatment. And even though these are preliminary and unpublished data, I think you can quickly see that even given, say, 1 million patients affected in Ethiopia, it would make enormous economic sense to treat them rather than to run the losses of leaving the disease untreated. Another consequence of the genetic study that Facile took forward was that we became aware as a research team of the vulnerability of the populations that we were studying. Almost by definition, they're far off the beaten track and have had very little experience of either scientists or research. We realised it was going to be very important to approach them in a responsible way. And to our luck, of course, found out that Bobby Farcides at this medical school had very recently taken forward a study with Susie Bull in Oxford, which used a process called rapid ethical assessment to map the ethical terrain of a research setting before research projects. And they'd piloted this in the Gambia very, very successfully. We thought this was a wonderful idea and took it forward before Facile's data collection in southern Ethiopia. He collected information from a range of individuals and talked with the community to understand the best approach to the community, how informed consent might best be gathered, and the best way of delivering results back to the community as well. And that has established really a model that we've used in several other studies since, including in Cameroon, where a similar genetic study is being undertaken. This shows Doris Nam, again, doing the qualitative work prior to the genetic study. It's also led into a much wider application of the rapid ethical assessment technique, which is being used by Dr. Adamu Adisi, also registered here at Brighton and Sussex and supervised by Bobby Farcides. He's looking at whether this technique could be used much more broadly before a range of studies in communities in Ethiopia. And he's to submit his PhD in the next couple of months. So I've dealt with one of the main causes of podoconiosis, the genetics. Now I'm going to move over to the mineral side of things, which is obviously quite a lot further from my comfort zone. We've worked with geologists and mineralogists, and down here is a volcanologist from Los Alamos Research Lab in America. We've worked with them, and we've done a number of joint field trips so that epidemiologists can understand the approaches that geologists use when gathering samples, and we can combine efforts in order to take samples that will reflect disease distribution and shed some light onto the soil or mineral trigger of podoconiosis. So here we see Jordanos Belaina, who's doing her PhD studies on the environmental correlates of this disease. This is Jen LeBlond, a postdoc geologist who's responsible for the processing of the soil and rock samples. She was based at the Natural History Museum and now at Imperial College. And together, we've been able to study in some detail an area of northern Ethiopia in which disease prevalence varies over a relatively small geographic distance. So this map here shows an area about 30 kilometres by 30 kilometres. The red dots represent disease prevalence in villages. The bigger the dot, the higher the prevalence. And the underlying colours indicate rock type. So the purples and pinks are flood basalts, and the greens and yellows are shield basalts from a 4,000-metre volcano called Mount Choke up here. And using these mapping techniques and sample collection techniques, we've been able to link disease prevalence with underlying mineralogy and geology, which is leading us towards understanding the trigger of the disease within the legs of people who live on these soils. And another spin-off of this project has interest purely really to geologists. So Jen LeBlanc has come up with a novel weathering index, and she's adapted an existing index and brought in some new mineral techniques to that, and has come up with a much more precise variation of this weathering index. We're interested in the possibility of also using some of the soil analysis for agricultural scientists who are interested in the fertility of the area. Back to something slightly more within the comfort zone of medics. There's a couple of studies in the laboratory sciences, and the first photo up here shows Mike Titheridge, who's in the audience. He's from Life Sciences here, and he led a study looking at oxidative stress factors in patients with early and late stage podoconiosis. This picture is of him in the biochemistry lab at Tikurambesa Hospital, training Sise Adisu in these techniques. And Sise was also involved in a later parasitological study. In this, we looked at the coincidence of podoconiosis and soil-transmitted helminths, or worms, in patients in southern Ethiopia. Now, some of the worms enter the body through the skin of the feet, so it made sense to us to look at whether these diseases were more common together in this area. They were, and what was more, we also were able to demonstrate that they had an interactive effect in terms of the anemia in patients. So one of the diseases caused 1 degree of anemia, and both conditions together made it significantly worse. Law. Now, this was really far outside my comfort zone, but I co-supervised a law master's student called Idris Meskele, as he looked at human rights issues related to patients with podoconiosis. And not surprisingly, he found that what was apparent on paper, what Ethiopia had ratified in terms of human rights instruments, was really never seen when you got to patient level in the field in Ethiopia. I'm now going to move on to three major and current projects in different disciplines again. And the first of these involves the behavioural sciences. One of the most common reactions to be explaining about this disease is for people to say, well, why don't you just give them all shoes? Now, of course, there's some very obvious practical problems with doing that. If there are even 1 million people affected in Ethiopia alone, that's an awful lot of shoes to get out to very remote rural areas. And then you've got to think about issues like creating dependency for these commodities. And of course, there might be a fledgling shoe industry struggling to survive. And if you go in and dump a load of shoes, you might well destroy that. So there are all sorts of issues around distribution of shoes, and possibly one of the biggest is the issue of whether people use them if they're given them. So, thanks for the reminder. I'm keeping an eye on it. Half an hour left. This is a real issue and has been noted by many of the groups that have distributed shoes. And I've got a picture here of a very common occurrence. This is rural Ethiopia. These two boys are aged about 7 and 8. They are following their father's plough and beating down the big clods into finer particles so that the seed can be sown. Now, one of these boys did have a pair of shoes, and it was there at the side of the field. Of course, he didn't use it while he was doing that work. We asked about, what he was doing and what his shoes were doing on the side of the field, and he said it was uncomfortable to use them. He got bits of soil inside. It was really uncomfortable to wear. So there's a huge issue in bringing that sort of behaviour where shoes might be used as prized possessions, worn to school maybe, to church or weddings or something like that, to a protective behavioural response and worn throughout the day, at play, when sent to fetch water or wood, and at school as well. So we've had enormous support from the National Institutes of Health, both in terms of expertise and in terms of funding, to take forward qualitative research to explore people's perceptions of shoes and using shoes, and also of heredity and other causes of disease, and to look at whether their understanding of heredity actually links to the preventive behaviours they take. We found that people who think that podoconiosis is strictly and only determined by genetic factors are very unlikely to take on board messages about wearing shoes, whereas people with a more nuanced view that there might be a genetic element, but it's also important to protect the feet from the soil, are much more likely to take on using shoes in future. The results of these exploratory studies were used to shape a behavioural intervention which is now under trial. The intervention package is made up of a catchy local song which is played on the radio, a series of posters. You can just about make out one of them here, and a household training session. And here we have Desta Ayode, who's leading this study. He's training lay health advisors to deliver this household training. And up here, we have one of the lay health advisors in a household giving, talking through this training with a household. And I love this picture because there's very little furniture in this house. They've given the only chair to the lay health advisor. They are on some tiny stools at much lower level. But what you do see is the prized picture of Man United on the wall. So at the moment, we've got 6 communities randomised in 3 groups, and we're testing the effectiveness of this intervention package in altering levels of stigma in the community at large and in altering preventive behaviours within families. We hope to have the results of that trial ready early next year, and it's looking likely that they will be very quickly taken up within Ethiopia and probably in other affected countries very soon. There's a real need for this sort of intervention package. So secondly, among these large and current studies is the nationwide mapping of podoconiosis. Now, this is a study that's been taken forward by Kebede Deribe, who I'm really delighted is here in the audience this evening. Kebede has been funded by the Wellcome Trust on a training fellowship to take forward the podoconiosis side of this joint mapping. Now, this is joint with the other main cause of tropical lymphedema, which is lymphatic filariasis. And this is the first time ever that the two diseases have been mapped together, a global first. So Kebede was responsible for training a huge team of data collectors who he split into 34 teams and covered more than 650 districts of Ethiopia. They have gathered data on almost 130,000 individuals around the country and astoundingly achieved this in a period of 4 months from June to October last year. I think even more remarkably was the fact that they did this during the rainy season in Ethiopia. And this was a photo that one of the data supervisors sent to me during data collection. He told me that they were going to a region called Bale in southeast Ethiopia, and the team met a landslide, a recent landslide. They spent 2 hours walking around it to reach the village, and I'm sure this wasn't an isolated occurrence. One thing that has really facilitated collection of data in this study is another very new development in community data collection, which is the use of Android-based data capture. So each team of data collectors had 2 smartphones, one for the Podoconiosis data, one for the LF data, and the data were entered and real-time transmitted to the Atlanta-based system where they're stored. So that meant that after cleaning of data, they were available for analysis in a really short period of time, which has meant that Kebede is now over spending time with Simon Brooker's team at the London School of Hygiene, analysing these data already. This is a map showing the distribution of the 1,300 villages that were involved in the data collection, and Kebede is soon to have ready a map that will be presented to the Ministry of Health to help them to help guide them in terms of training health professionals and ensuring that treatment consumables are available in each of the districts that are deemed endemic for podoconiosis. And then lastly, we kind of full circle back to clinical medicine and another large project looking at what treatment really works. There was informal evidence from 2 projects, one in Western Ethiopia and the other in the south, that very, very simple measures, and when I say simple, it's as simple as washing the feet with soap and water, applying an ointment or oil to improve the skin barrier function, bandaging where there is soft swelling, use of socks and shoes, and then using exercises and elevation of the foot when the patient's at rest. So it is pretty simple stuff, and as I've said earlier, relatively cheap in terms of interventions. So the first step was to gather very pilot information that this was effective in some way. So 30 patients were followed over the course of a year, and the effect of this very simple package was noted. It improved the clinical condition of their feet, and it improved their quality of life as well. And this formed the basis of an application for a much larger, pragmatic, randomised controlled trial that, as Julian mentioned, has been funded by the MRC, the Wellcome and UK Aid. And this, again, looks at the effects of this treatment package, this time in 680 patients, half of whom will receive treatment immediately and half of whom will act as a control group and receive the treatment later. And we're looking at the impact of the intervention on clinical outcomes like acute episodes, on quality of life, on stigma, and on productivity. So that's a sort of whistle-stop tour of several of the studies that have been undertaken so far in podoconiosis over the last decade or so. I'm going to move briefly on to advocacy now and come back to this whole issue of poster children. So poster children are sort of emblems or symbols in some way of movements or causes. I've chosen a couple of pretty well-known examples. Here is Sylvia Diggory, the poster child of the NHS. She happened to be in hospital in Manchester on July the 5th, 1948, when the NHS was launched, and got this unexpected visit from Aneurin Bevan. This, on the other hand, is Burhan Wuldu, who was the poster child of the 1984 Ethiopian famine. And I only show this really because I can also show the picture of her 20 years later, about to start her postgraduate studies. So those are two very well-known examples, poster children of different causes or ideals. And I think bearing these in mind, it's okay to think of podoconiosis as a poster child for global health research. These three themes that I've mentioned earlier are encompassed by the disease and by the research that's been a response to the disease. So I feel it's very appropriate that here at BSMS we act as a global hub for podoconiosis research, we integrate the research, and we act as a hub within the recently formed Wellcome Trust Centre for Global Health Research. It all seems to fit very, very well. What do we do as we integrate the research? Well, it's partly about sharing information among these disciplines. So, for example, the people in genetics know what the people in mineralogy have found recently. The people in the GIS world understand what's going on in geology as well. It's partly about sharing of information within the research teams, and it's partly about extracting the key messages from this research and making sure that they arrive at the correct audiences as quickly as possible to influence patient care. So I'm going to run through a few of the advocacy achievements over the last few years. Again, Julian has mentioned some of these. So presentation of many of the elements of the research that I've shown you has ensured that podoconiosis was included in the WHO list of neglected tropical diseases. Now, that doesn't sound like a very big achievement to be included in a list of neglected diseases, but it has been very, very important. The neglected tropical diseases is a really thriving, exciting area to be in, and we feel very lucky to be part of that grouping now. Then Footwork was launched, the International Podoconiosis Initiative. This aims to bring together public and private partners to raise awareness of the disease globally, to further research into podoconiosis, and to make sure that intervention reaches the countries where it's most needed. And the website for Footwork is there at the bottom, and it's also on the back of these cards, which are available outside and possibly in your seats too. And if you go to the website, you'll see there is a page through which you can make a donation to make sure that the results of research do get translated into care for patients. Another development in 2012 was registration of the National Podoconiosis Action Network in Ethiopia. This is an umbrella organisation which coordinates and harmonises the different NGOs working on the condition and delivering services to patients. It also acts as an advocacy body and was very successful in bringing about this achievement last summer, in which podoconiosis was prioritised as one of the 8 neglected tropical diseases included in the master plan for NTD control. That was a video developed to mobilise support for provision of shoes for children to prevent podoconiosis. And I would draw attention to this group, Tom's, a US-based shoe company whose strapline is that they give a pair of shoes to a child who needs them for every pair that's sold. And they have lived up to their word and have distributed several 100,000 pairs of shoes within Ethiopia, many of those to children at high risk of podoconiosis. This is a photo of one of the distributions happening. Shoes are also used for tertiary prevention. That means prevention of complications in people already with disease. And this second photo shows patients who have treated themselves and are then being trained to make strong leather shoes to protect other patients from further exposure to the soil. This clearly is another way of boosting income for patients as well. What else is happening for patients in terms of intervention? Well, other NGOs have taken up the cause of providing services to patients with podoconiosis, so that there is now service provision in about 10 zones in 3 regions of Ethiopia, in Oromia, in Amhara, and in southern nations. But we now know from Kebede's nationwide mapping that our original estimate of 1 million patients with podoconiosis is likely to be a gross underestimate. It's very clear that NGOs on their own can't tackle the disease, even within Ethiopia. It's vital that the government comes in and shares responsibility for this condition. And they are showing every sign of doing that with the inclusion of podoconiosis in the NTD master plan and with the willingness on the basis of the results of the mapping to take forward training of health professionals in endemic areas. That's within Ethiopia, which is where most of the action is happening at present in podoconiosis. But I should also say that 2 other heavily endemic countries, Cameroon and Uganda, are in preliminary stages wanting to set up programs. The disease has been clearly identified in both these countries, and they've asked for experience sharing between professionals in Ethiopia and health professionals in each of these countries. So that will be the next step. But then, as you can see, there are many other countries in which podoconiosis has been described. There's a long way to go still before treatment's brought to all the patients that need it around the world. So that's really covered my involvement in podoconiosis and in research into podoconiosis. You can see that we've come a tremendously long way in 10 years, but there's a lot further to go. No one individual could do any of this, and I want to thank a range of people, some of whom are present today. First of all, to the research team, or teams if you like. There are over 50 people now involved in podoconiosis research, and the number grows week by week. I always welcome more. To our funders and partners, I've mentioned most of these funders going through the talk, and so I want to draw particular attention to the 2 intervention partners, Mossifoot International and International Orthodox Christian Charities. They have provided incredibly valuable logistic support for research and responsible ways of reaching patients and doing research among them. And we're all deeply grateful for their involvement in this. And now some other personal thank yous, which I understand it's okay to do in an inaugural. I want to thank my immediate family, Richard, Almi and Lucas, here seen in the offices of the Great Ethiopian Run in Addis Ababa, which is their more natural habitat than Brighton. Thank you for not just enduring me droning on about this condition over the last 10 years, but for so actively cheering me on through it and bearing with me through frequent absences from home. I want to thank my Ethiopian father, Ato Meskele Ashin. He was the person that first introduced me to podoconiosis and who immediately saw the value of high-quality research in bringing this condition to the attention of a global audience. He died early 2 years ago, and I know he would be delighted with the progress so far. I want to thank my career parents, and I suppose I should really say mentors here, because obviously the generational difference is not there. And I want to name 4: John Britton, Melanie Newport, Alan Fennick and David Molyneux. 2 of them are here today, Melanie obviously, and Alan has kindly come down from Imperial as well. But I want to thank all 4 really for their guidance and support through what's been a rather haphazard and serendipitous career. I should also mention Professor Eldred Parry, who's in the audience too, who's been a kind of a father figure all through this process. It was he that arranged for Richard and I our situation in Ethiopia after a chance meeting in the bicycle sheds at the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine. My real parents, Jane and Peter, shown here. They've come up from Cornwall. They're shown here in Scotland, actually, in, again, their more natural habitat, which is on the water. But Mum and Dad, thanks so much for your constant support for all 4 of us children in whatever direction we've taken. And finally, I want to give thanks to our Eternal Father, without whom none of this could have happened. The book of Micah shows very clearly that God doesn't want us just to be religious. He wants his followers to embody his characteristics of justice, of mercy, and of humility. I've had the honour and the privilege to do this in podoconiosis and podoconiosis research for the last decade, and I can think of no better way to spend the rest of my working life. Thanks very much.